One of the reasons I love video games so much is because of their ability to elicit an emotional response from the player. The fact that a few pixels on a screen can make you feel sad or frustrated or just content is an idea that sticks in my brain indefinitely. The concept of a game emotionally affecting a player is what got me interested in game design, and from a very early age I wanted to understand how this was possible. But recently I came across something that completely flipped what I thought about game design on its head. While recording footage for another video, I started playing a game that I had never experienced before. The art style was incredibly unique, and the gameplay was so smooth that it almost felt as though I was watching a carefully crafted movie. Of course, the game I'm referring to is the sensational Cuphead. For some reason, this game that I had never played before awakened a deep sense of nostalgia that I couldn't shake off. The music, sound, art style, and controls all culminated into a strong feeling of being back on my childhood couch in my Super Mario pajamas and mismatched slippers. This sensation was confusing, to say the least. For me, I didn't grow up playing the type of run-and-gun games that Cuphead was based around. I didn't listen to the type of barbershop or swing music that was found in the game, and I certainly did not grow up watching the rubber hose style of cartoons when I was younger. In fact, when I was little, I found that type of animation to be unsettling and, frankly, a little creepy. So, why was this game causing me to feel so much nostalgia? How was it possible that an experience I've never had made me reminisce about my childhood? Of course, for me over the years, I've realized that game design is an incredibly powerful and intentional tool, so the answers were probably right in front of me as long as I was willing to dig a little deeper. This experience made me want to see how games can utilize the power of nostalgia, and I also wanted to take a deeper look at the thought that nostalgia blindness is the only thing keeping retro games alive. I am a retro gamer. Ever since I was little, I've been intrigued by the games of the past, and that feeling has never really faded away from me. When I was just 2 years old, my dad handed me a controller with one of the greatest games of all time, Super Mario Bros. 3, and even though at that age I couldn't get past the first level, the game left such an imprint on me that I can't imagine who I'd be without it. At this point in my life, I didn't have a sense of what games were better or worse. All I knew is that the games that I was playing were fun, and it wasn't until much later that I would notice how older games were truly different. One year for my dad's birthday, my mother decided that she was going to buy him the latest Mario game, New Super Mario Bros. For the Wii. And looking back, I'm not quite sure whether she wanted to get a good gift or just wanted to play the new title for herself, but nevertheless, my mom bought the game and wrapped it up for him to open on his birthday. As my father opened his gift, I remember him showing me the cover art and my mind being absolutely blown. The characters were rendered cleaner than a Pixar movie, and the composition of the cover art was unlike anything I had seen before. But it wasn't until after my dad flipped the case around that I realized how insanely different this game truly was. The back of the case showed what the gameplay actually looked like, and to my eyes, it was identical to the renders on the front of the box. It was as if someone had just shown you a live-action movie and then tried to convince you that each frame was a colored pencil drawing. Yeah, unbelievable. But even after I played New Super Mario Bros., I didn't lose the love I had for those classic titles. In fact, when I asked my father why this game was different, his answer made me even more interested in the past. He told me that computers are more powerful than they used to be, so at the time, Super Mario Bros. 3 was the new Super Mario Bros. Of that generation. Surprisingly, this realization didn't make me crave the next graphical upgrade or make me want to see how much better the controls would be in the next title. No, it made me wonder why the games that were quote-unquote worse could be so amazing and fun to play. Ever since that moment, I have tried my best to experience as much as I possibly can, and because of that, I have an incredible nostalgia for a generation that wasn't even mine. Believe it or not, my grandmother was a huge gamer who had every Nintendo home console that had come out to that point, and I got the chance to have a similar experience to past generations because of it. I can't tell you the amount of memories I have blowing into a Nintendo cartridge for an hour just to play for 10 minutes, and I certainly can't express the nostalgia I have for searching and making a book of Game Genie codes with my grandmother, and I definitely cannot convey the emotions I feel when I hear the satisfying click of the Super Nintendo power switch. All of this is to say that my nostalgia is extremely strong towards a lot of games that weren't necessarily meant for me, but I have always kind of agreed that my attachment to these titles were strongly tied to the fact that I had played them when I was young. I've never really thought that a game could make me feel nostalgic unless it was specifically linked to my memories, but somehow, without music I grew up with, without the classic pixel art style I'm used to, and without the clunky controls of countless NES titles, Cuphead evoked that same type of nostalgia. The fundamental base of the game was able to trigger some weird reminiscence without using the visual, auditory, or even tactile memories that I have, but how can that be possible? While thinking about this question, I decided the best course of action would be to compile all of the games that had this weird effect on me and then compare what design traits they had in common. For starters, there are the obvious ones such as Stardew Valley, The Escapist 2, Kingdom 2 Crowns, and of course, Shovel Knight. Each of these games for me tap into the nostalgia on a surface level, that being the pixelated art style. And of course, there are the sequels or successors to my most nostalgic titles, such as Yoshi's Woolly World, Mario Kart Wii, Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze, and Luigi's Mansion 3. It's not hard to see why I would feel nostalgic about these titles, as they directly call back and build off the games that I originally played. Yoshi's Woolly World brings me back to the agonizing screams of Baby Mario, Mario Kart Wii brings me to the lighthearted competitions me and my cousins used to have, and Luigi's Mansion 3 brings me back to when me and my grandmother would sit down on the couch and unlock a few rooms in the creepy, sprawling mansion. No, what's really puzzling are the titles that make me feel this way for seemingly no reason. Little Big Planet, Unravel 2, and Rayman Origins are all games that I played well into the future, and yet they take me back. In the past, I had chalked this up to the fact that they are platformers, but that doesn't explain why a game like Castle Crashers can have this effect on me. You could say it's because of the 2D art style in that game, but then why would I feel at home with games like Portal, Overcooked 2, Monster Hunter Rise, or even Human Fall Flat? There seemed to be no pattern to these games, no real connection that my brain should make in order to feel nostalgic. And funnily enough, there are a bunch of games that should make me feel nostalgic that just don't. Undertale and Celeste are amazing titles, but something about them just don't itch that same scratch, which is very strange to me considering they have the surface level nostalgia bait that tends to get to me. The newest mainline Mario titles don't really make me feel nostalgic for older Mario games. Mario Party Superstar has actual boards and minigames for my favorite Mario parties, but I'm not brought back to the times that my brother went from 1 to 5 stars in one turn, and Super Mario Maker 2 literally has the old titles built into the game, and yet it's not the same feeling I usually feel with nostalgia. Because of these inconsistencies, I started to think that I was just an odd case. Surely there is no logical reason as to why I'm getting enveloped in a feeling of familiarity when I've never even played some of these titles previously. But while doing some research on what nostalgia actually is, it confirmed my suspicions that this phenomenon is more rooted in a game's design rather than just the shell a game has on the outside. Nostalgia is commonly thought of as something that makes you think about the past, but as I've been saying, it's more accurately something that triggers an emotional familiarity, and as we all know when it comes to game design, emotions are the strongest way of changing how a player perceives a game. So having a game trigger an emotional response that leads to a feeling of nostalgia doesn't feel like that big of a leap. Now, obviously game studios are not siphoning some magical memory potion out of gamers and slamming it into their games, but what is more likely is that designers are purposefully creating an emotional response that they know you're already familiar with, while also improving on mechanics to ensure that you still feel like you do when you have your rose-tinted glasses on. The basic fundamentals of game design come down to a few universal principles that are absolutely everywhere. A sense of reward, a sense of punishment, goals, constraints, and consistency are about as basic as you can get. Each of these principles are used in every game to 1. Have a game, and 2. Force the players to emotionally connect. I have already made a video talking about the sense of reward and plan on making in-depth videos about the rest, so for now, we will only briefly touch on them. The sense of reward is the concept of making a player have a positive emotional response towards the outcome of your game's mechanics. Basically, if you want a player to explore, then the outcome needs to have a substantial amount of reward in order to create a want for exploring. This can be done in infinite ways, but some of the most obvious examples are weapons, money, and extra lives. The sense of punishment is the idea that unwanted actions provide negative consequences. After all, if there were no lives in the original Mario Bros. And you could never get a game over, dying wouldn't mean anything. These two concepts obviously work in tandem with each other, but it's important to note that going overboard on either can result in a sour experience. Too much reward and it loses value. Too much punishment and having fun becomes impossible. Now, the concept of goals in your game is arguably the most important of these principles, and that is due to the fact that with no goal, it doesn't matter how good your rewards or punishments are. They mean nothing. If my goal is not to beat these levels, then why does it matter if I die? Why does it matter if I get coins? They don't affect my ability to complete my goal, because there is none. Some could argue that sandbox games don't have a goal, but this is simply not true. The difference is that the designer doesn't have a goal to give to the player. Instead, the designer's goal is simply to encourage players to create their own goals. Take for example the most popular sandbox game of all time, Minecraft. The player is not given a direct goal to complete. Instead, they are encouraged to make their own. Cut down this tree, dig some dirt, make a house, don't mine at night. The fact that you feel encouraged to make your own goal simply is the goal in the first place. Now, constraints are needed in order to prevent your goal, reward, and punishment from being meaningless. Say hypothetically somebody made a version of Pong, but with no constraints. Now, this is literally impossible because a player's wants or actions are seemingly infinite, but let's just pretend somehow it worked. The player could make it so that when the opponent scored, it gave them a point. Or they could simply make it impossible for them to score in the first place. And if you can't lose, winning is the default, or in other words, meaningless. Lastly, we have consistency. Without consistency, there is no way for a player to set goals because they don't know what actions denote which responses. If 50% of the time a mushroom would turn Mario into a Super Mario and the other 50% of the time it would kill him, well, then you would be confused as to what you did wrong, much like a colorblind me playing Super Mario Bros. Lost Levels for the first time. All of these mechanics are apparent in every game, so it's not like older games were using them more or less. What's really happening here is that older games were forced to tackle these mechanics vastly differently from newer titles. These inherent differences create a near-perfect environment for nostalgia to grow in the first place. What truly causes nostalgia to develop comes down to how memorable a game is. There are two big factors that determine memorableness, but for starters, the main factor is simplicity. Older games are naturally more simple because of the many limitations hardware had at the time. Because of this, it's much easier to remember more. For instance, if you played the first level of the original Super Mario Bros. And the first level of New Super Mario Bros. U, you would be more likely to remember the original 1-1 because it's far less complicated. Much like how a song's lyrics stick in your head the more simple, you are likely to remember more about a less complex game. The reason this is so important is because it is easy to remember or long for a simple feeling. Because older games' designs are simpler, the complexity of feelings that you have are much more straightforward as well. Games today can make you feel angry, guilty, upset, and yet justified all at once, but simpler games tend to make you feel just one feeling at a time. It is hard to feel nostalgic for a complicated array of feelings, especially when compared to only feeling happy or mad. Now, when it comes to sequels of video games, it is not enough to just be simple. Sequels need to directly expand on what the previous entries introduced. The jump from The Legend of Zelda to Link to the Past is a perfect example of expanding what the previous games nailed down. Everything feels more. And the game itself is more memorable because you can directly compare it to the older games. Although, keep in mind that expanding way too much or changing too much overcomplicates the comparison and overall feel of the game, which tends to kill the nostalgia that would normally be there. These two aspects can make a game wildly more memorable, but that isn't the only trick that game developers use to make you reminisce. Developers will usually try to increase the positive emotion and decrease the negative when attempting to make a game feel nostalgic. This is due to the fact that people like to remember good feelings over bad, which is the main reason that the rose-tinted glasses phenomenon is so apparent. You are more likely to remember the cool levels in Donkey Kong Country rather than the unfair platformer sections, so taking those original games and not improving on the more negative aspects will make the players feel as though the game is worse even if it's exactly the same. People remember games based on the happy feelings that they experienced, so developers need to ensure that new games feel like the memories we have in our heads. The last thing is something that game developers seem to get slightly wrong, which is that it's not helpful to bring back something people remember if it means sacrificing something that was already established later on. What I mean is, for a game like Mario Party Superstars to bring back the old courses and minigames, it's not enough when you can still directly compare how older titles were actually better or truly had more content. If you end up backtracking from something that worked, you give people an easy comparison and justification for older titles being better. All of the games I've mentioned follow this sort of template. Keep it simple, expand on previous entries, increase positive and decrease negative emotion, and make sure not to backtrack on something that worked. Kingdom 2 Crowns, Stardew Valley, The Escapist 2, and Shovel Knight all keep it simple while also expanding on what we know. As well, each title is able to increase the positive emotion we feel when playing them. Shovel Knight does this excellently, to the point where it feels completely seamless and you barely notice the differences within the game. The fact that there are checkpoints but you still lose something when you die gets rid of the annoying feeling of restarting the entire game, while also keeping the feeling of the retro difficulty. Yoshi's Woolly World was able to create the same effect and make me feel like I did when I played the original Yoshi's Island, while Yoshi's Crafted World, although compared to Yoshi's Island, did hit most of these points, didn't have the same impact because it felt like it was missing some of the charm and content that Yoshi's Woolly World had. Castle Crashers at its core hit all of these markers while also adding an incredible spin on those types of games, so even though I haven't really played those games before, it still portrayed the spirit of older titles. And it's a very similar story with Overcooked 2, Portal, and Human Fall Flat. When I noticed this pattern, I started to realize that the inconsistencies weren't completely with me. Mario Maker took away the fundamental simplicity of just playing Mario. Mario Kart 8, for me, took away and backtracked from what made my connection with Mario Kart Wii so special. And the new Super Mario Bros. Series has felt like it hasn't been expanding since the second entry. What all of this means is that game developers can actually utilize the strategies to inject a sort of artificial nostalgia into their games. By simplifying or designing around simplicity, you inherently make your game more memorable. By expanding on what has previously been, you create moments that are naturally more memorable because they are new. By eliminating or improving the negative aspects of a game that people choose to forget, you also eliminate the ability for people to think it was better in the past. What this means going forward is that as games get more and more complicated, older games will slowly get less and less complicated by comparison. Newer games are training people to comprehend more, to remember more complex feelings, to be able to feel nostalgia for things that used to feel so grand in scope. For a little while now, the GameCube era, which is my most nostalgic era, has slowly become more and more nostalgic over time, and I don't think that this is just due to more time passing. It's also caused by newer games training people to remember and comprehend more. Pretty soon, the Wii will be next, PS3 games will feel like tiny little adventures, and the Xbox 360 will be the clunky, odd one out, much like the original Xbox is today. I don't think older games are inherently worse because they are simpler, and I don't think newer games are inherently better because they're new. Maybe it's just because of nostalgia blindness, or maybe it's just because they stick in my head more, but one thing is for certain, nostalgia is not some magical power with no reason. In fact, when we are talking about video games, it's another tool in us game developers' arsenal. Oh, before I go, I want to say a huge thank you to everyone who has joined me for this journey so far. The support is absolutely insane, and the fact that I have already passed 200 subscribers after 1 week is unbelievable. And of course, I can't forget about my patrons, or patron, I should say. Thank you so much for believing in me enough to support me directly. It means the world to me, and of course, Zelda as well.